Well, thank you all for coming to this Statistics Under Pressure session. It's really good to see so many people here, particularly given the size of the room. It would be, no, it's really good to see so many. We're going to sort of do this in many different formats this morning, or this afternoon. We're going to have some case study presentations about some of the ideas behind the project. We'll talk a little bit about the project itself, the principles, and then at the end we'll have a panel discussion, and we definitely ask for questions from you. Apparently, if you go to the app and go to this session, there is an Ask Questions button, which you're very welcome to submit questions by if you'd like to write them down. If you'd like to just raise your hand at the appropriate times, either after the case studies or during the panel discussion, please feel free to do that too. The Statistics Under Pressure project. So I'm John Aston. I was very fortunate to chair this project along with Paul, Crystal, Claire, Sarah, and an awful lot of the work was done by Denise from the RSS. Basically, the idea is that in many modern settings, COVID was a very notable one, but certainly, as you'll see from the case studies, by far not the only one. Statisticians are placed in really high-pressure situations where data is required in either very time-pressured situations or for very sensitive and very important questions. And the question is, how do you then balance up the kind of considerations you have to make in order to make sure that the data and the insight that you can get from that data is actually going to be useful for the decision-making going on. And so this project was really about to understand how we could go about capturing some of that so that statisticians who were placed in that position had some principles and ideas and had seen some case studies that would show how you might be able to react in that situation and have some guidance about how you do that. So the idea of the Statistics Under Pressure project was to really try to understand the trade-offs that can be employed, making sure that we adhere to good practice among statisticians and analysts. Really to improve the ability of those who are receiving the information to interpret it and use data and statistics which had been created at pace and understand what that means, and particularly around things like uncertainty. Really to try and promote in times before those situations arrive the kind of platforms and things that are necessary so that those things can then be produced at pace later on, particularly things like data platforms, team structures so that you can actually do this when required. Really think about how you might do really good communication between statisticians and non-statisticians, decision makers, analysts. Really get that communication built in the first place so that you could really then use that when we come to the point of view of trying to do that in times of pressure. And then really sort of help people in the wider statistical community get behind the fact that sometimes statisticians do have to do things at pace. And therefore, sometimes trade-offs do have to be made. And how can we, as a community, say, yeah, that makes sense. If you've got to do this and you've got to do that, that's fine. But in actual fact, that's too far. You can't go that far. So how do we make sure that people understand that? How do we make sure people understand when we can do good stuff? And when in actual fact, sometimes we have to just say, sorry, no. That we can't get that out of the data. So this project was designed to try to really understand how we might go about doing that. And so the first thing we did, and we're really grateful to all those who were involved, particularly across GSS, but much wider statistical community as well, was to try to find some case studies. And so if you look at the RSS website, and there's some really great pages on the RSS website around this project, you'll see that there are 8 case studies, of which we're going to talk about 3 today. But these case studies range from an awful lot of different areas of statistics and decision making. And I think they all highlight different trade-offs that people needed to think about and different places where they needed to actually decide, do I do this or do I do that? What's the trade-off? What's the risk? How do I describe the uncertainty? How do I describe what I've lost when doing this at pace? And really, these case studies really highlight the kinds of things that you need to think about when you're doing this work at pace. So we're really fortunate today to have 3 of those case studies come to present to us today. And our first case study is going to be around badger culling and infectious disease and cattle health, how much data is enough. And Crystal's going to very kindly come and present that.
Thank you very much indeed. So I'm going to be talking about the randomized badger culling trial And specifically, although it has the badgers in the title, what it is a trial looking at the control of cattle disease. So it's trying to reduce the risk of bovine TB to cattle herds and looking at this. And so the question is then, how much data is enough? So this is looking at a trial, which I'll abbreviate to the RBCT, Randomized Badger Culling Trial. It commenced in 1998, and it involved the randomization of 3 different treatments. So in one of these was no culling, so that is this sort of baseline comparison group. We decided to not call it the control group because the other ones were trying to do other things to control disease. So that's the comparison group. And then there were 2 sorts of culling that were introduced. One was a form of localized culling that was limited and one-off in response to confirmed TB in a cattle herd. And the other was proactive culling, which was culling across each of these areas. These areas were approximately 100 square kilometer in size, and they were annually culled for proactive culling. Now, this shows you, the map shows you where 20 of the areas are. That is from the paper in which we analyzed data for the localized reactive culling. So it shows you pairs of these areas, so in different colors. So then one of those, which I can't now remember whether it's the solid or the outline, is reactive culling, and the other one is no culling. And so they were in similar areas, so they might have similar ecological conditions. Now, this didn't all happen all of a sudden. There was a recruitment of trial areas. So as I mentioned, the trial started in 1998, and so the first proactive culls, these are those annual culls, started in late 1998, but it wasn't until 2002 that there had been enrollment of all 10 sets of these areas. So we called them triplets. A set of 3. You might call it a trio, but we had called it triplets, so that I'm using that terminology. These sets of 3 were recruited, and they were sort of enrolled when the first proactive cull, that first annual cull, had been completed, and that sort of started the clock to record the outcome, and the outcome was these incidents of TB in cattle herds, so that's sometimes called a cattle breakdown. So it took some time for all of these areas to get recruited due to resourcing. And there was also a break. You notice if you look at that, 2001, there was a foot and mouth disease outbreak in the UK, and that stopped the badger culling that took place in the trial, and it stopped the recruitment of farms, and that was because they're trying to minimize the people going in and out of farms of cloven-hoofed animals that could be affected by foot and mouth disease, whether that's cows, sheep, or pigs, and so that caused some delays. I'll jump to the publication. So in 2003, then we published our results comparing the incidence of bovine TB in cattle herds in areas that had reactive culling, that's these localized culling, to the control areas. And what we found in that was that there was a 27% increase in the areas that had been subjected to badger culling. So on the face of it, that's quite a surprise because these were being put forward as control measures, and the hypothesis was that badgers were contributing to TB risk in cattle, and therefore removing some of them should reduce risk, and perhaps you'd expect that when you remove more, it would reduce the risk further. So we found this 27% increase. This is using quite a simple model, a Poisson log linear model, and you can see here the areas. This is plotted the predicted breakdowns per herd in the reactive areas. So predicted if there had been no effective reactive culling, and this is what was observed. And you see that of the 10 reactive areas, 9 of them appear above the line, have increased risk. The one that doesn't is J, and that's the one that hadn't actually had any reactive culling by the time that this started. So it hadn't, that part of the policy hadn't even gotten started by the time we published it. And other considerations at this point was to look at extra Poisson variation. Was there more variation than expected? So not tremendously much. The sort of multiplication factor to make the confidence interval wider was about 1.4. And we were quite cautious in our conclusion, not to conclude reactive culling definitely makes things worse, but our results suggest that this form of culling had produced no benefit in terms of the control of TB in cattle. Now, if we look more specifically at the timeline, this was happening at a time when we had, so data were collected up through August 2003 for this. We undertook analyses in September and October, and the publication was published in November. In the meantime, reactive badger culling was suspended. It was originally suspended rather than stopped completely because there were considerations of was that jumping the gun? Was it too soon to stop this? In fact, as a group, we made a recommendation, actually, that although we had found it, so our protocol was that if we found a significant result, that we would take it and share it with ministers and officials, and we did so. But as a group, the group that had designed and analyzed the trial, we suggested that we actually collect 6 more months of data before we could make a more definitive finding. Part of the reason for that is that we wanted to consider how certain were we of the result, and to not sort of preemptively shut down this possibility, because once the reactive culling had stopped, then it might be very difficult to start. And so we then had, after November, we had a review by Charles Godfrey and his group that looked at this, and he concluded that from a narrow scientific view, ignoring the political and possible legal implications of an experiment that appeared to cause an increase in risk, that the reactive treatment had been abandoned too soon. And that was very carefully phrased by Charles and his group to point out that the decision that was being made, and the decision was not made by the statisticians on the group, which included myself and David Cox. It was not made by the independent scientific group on cattle TB. It was made by the minister. And the minister, of course, does have to look at the political and legal implications and can't just look at the scientific one. So it has to be looked at in the whole. It's important, though, to keep in mind that, as I pointed out, it wasn't us that made the policy decision, but we did recommend that, that there had been continued culling for up to 6 months. And the reason for that was so that we felt that we could get more information. It also, because of a closed period, so there was by design, a ban for culling not to happen between the beginning of February and the end of April each year. And that was at a time when dependent cubs would be left underground while their mother could potentially have been caught and culled. So we recommended that additional data be collected, but we understood the decision that was made. And so as part of the publication, we actually put in this statement of support, saying we supported the decision to discontinue the experimental treatment. And that was understanding the consideration that it's one thing, farmers didn't have to, they weren't forced to take part in the trial, but they could opt in. But the idea that the government would continue to support this treatment when they had some evidence that it was making the situation worse. And certainly what there wasn't any of was evidence that it was making the situation better, which is what we were looking for. Additional data was subsequently collected, for example, looking at the ranging behavior of badgers as well as the density of badgers in those areas, which there's plenty you can read about in the 20 years that has happened since then. But it was just an interesting case study when we had this discussion of times when the statistical results came through and then this counterbalance between the need to make a political decision and collect more data. Thank you.
From what you presented, it seemed like the evidence from this trial was reasonably conclusive that it wasn't going to be helpful. Did it seem plausible that 6 more months worth of data would have totally changed that and changed the recommendations in the future?
Well, it might have allowed us to look at the variation within these trial areas and examine that further. I think it was partly breathing space to give us a chance to look at it further. It also did, what happened actually in that next closed period was that we collected data on badger ranging. So it was before you had small enough GPS collars to put them on a badger. And so what you did was the old-fashioned way of you put something badgers like to eat, like peanuts and treacle, and you put the badgers that eat over here, the peanuts and treacle have blue beads, and the ones over here, they have red beads, and then someone goes out and maps them. And what we found was that the areas that had badger culling, reactive badger culling, had fewer badgers, because one of the hypotheses was maybe it just looks worse because the farmers in the area randomized to no culling had been getting together and culling badgers when no one was looking. So actually the reactive areas had more. So we found fewer bait returns, that's those colored beads when they come back out of a badger, but also we found that the colored beads were more widely distributed. So the badgers that remained were moving around more widely. And another subsequent result was that we found that badgers on subsequent culls had higher prevalence. So you're decreasing the population, but increasing the prevalence in there. So the impacts of badger culling is a trade-off. But we subsequently gained a lot of insight into this. But it was just quite a fraught situation where tensions were very high. It was, some hoped, a middle way going forward for people who didn't want to see really didn't feel comfortable with badger culling, but maybe a little bit of strategic badger culling in these key areas could be the solution. And it took out this middle way. And you've seen what's happened since then, if you followed it over 20 years, that one government has decided definitely to go with badger culling, other ones have decided definitely not to because of the risks.
Thank you for that presentation. I was thinking 21 years later, what insights have you got about communication and what you managed to communicate then and what you'd communicate now? And does cattle TB still happen, which I think it does, and what you would do differently now, and or whether you can really use all the results of 20 years ago to, to convince the farmers what is the best thing to do?
Okay, well, there are several different layers to that of communication. I mean, one thing is I would never see it as my job to convince farmers of anything in particular. I can sort of explain this is what the evidence is. Layered on top of that is then a political and practical decision that's made. I think if we had done sort of scenario analyses, going through and having the discussions about what would we do if, the different sort of things, which those sort of discussions hadn't been had while the data were being collected. I mean, partly we did expect to have more time before, we didn't really expect anything to show up so quickly. It was originally designed to have 50 triplet years, so on average, each of these would go about 50 years. So that subsequently happened, so the result for proactive culling didn't come out for 3 more years. So it was quite a long time till late 2005, so we thought we had more time. But definitely doing scenario analysis. Now those scenarios will play differently depending on different advisors and different politicians, but I think just going through and thinking through that possibility of what would you do if, because at that point, I mean, in some sense that wasn't the independent scientific group's responsibility to think about that, but I think we could have had some discussions about what considerations would you, what other things might you have wanted to know under different scenarios.
Thank you. Wonderful. So yeah, I thought it would be useful to start with kind of a bit of context of where we were prior to COVID-19 in the Department for Transport. So I would say back in the day, the hallmark of our stats were kind of like Michelin-starred level of statistics and data. For example, like this delicious lemon pie you can see here. So what you would expect is like a massive value add that we were providing on top of just regular data. So you could expect things to be incredibly comprehensive. We have stats that go back over 100 years as like unbroken time series, and you can think it's very rare to find those kind of things. They're also extremely extensive, so you could expect to see like a lot of analyst insight, discussing policy changes, and basically not just numbers, but also a lot of kind of context and understanding, as well as breakdowns. So you could expect to see things broken down by region, possibly by demographics, things like that. It really was like a very wide array of how things were published and like the context we gave to them. They're also very regular, by which I mean you could expect to see them on a very regular basis, but possibly not a frequent basis. So a lot of our statistics came out annually, quarterly if you were very lucky. And they were often kind of aggregated and single mode. So when you got that quarterly data, you'd get it for maybe the last quarter, maybe the quarter before, as like one aggregated number. And like I say, obviously there'd therefore be a delay in when you receive those statistics because of the time it takes to produce that kind of quality content, as well as like receiving the data, processing it, all the rest of it. We also had to make sure the formats met the needs of a lot of different types of users. So if you've ever seen like DFT or any kind of official stats, you'll often see like a report which has many different charts, like I say, this long kind of long form commentary, but also lots and lots of like data table breakdowns. So like whether you're kind of a casual user who just wants to look at some charts, or if you're kind of a bit of a data fiend and you want to kind of dive through that data, you can see that as well. And it's worth noting as well that the reason we didn't produce granular time series a lot of the time is because there wasn't that much call for it in a lot of the data that we have. So if you imagine something like road length statistics, we put out an annual figure of how long the roads are. Nobody is asking us for a daily update of how long the roads are, because the roads are the same length as they were yesterday. Like, we haven't built like 100 miles of road overnight. So it's not just that we couldn't do this, it's that people didn't really want this. And then COVID, I think we kind of all remember COVID as probably a time when it changed the way people expected to be able to interact with data regularly. If you remember, obviously, those kind of nightly briefings, it seems like a distant memory now. People were expecting to see data, and they were expecting to see it like from the day before. So my analogy on the previous slide of this kind of beautiful Michelin-starred lemon pie, people didn't want that. They wanted to sit on their sofa and eat like a whole packet of Jaffa cakes, which I'm sure a lot of people did, like literally, but also like metaphorically in terms of data. People also wanted to see lots and lots of data, as much data as they could, as fast as possible. But the reason I've also chosen Jaffa cakes here is because I think Jaffa cakes are the best biscuit. I won't be taking debate on this, unfortunately. So the point is that we didn't want to give people garbage biscuits to sit and eat in data terms. We wanted it to still be a quality product, but possibly not something that took the time of that kind of Michelin-starred lemon pie. And it also changed the questions people were asking about transport. Previously, people would be asking like these kind of big time series questions. So like I say, like, what are the factors that affected travel in the last year? Like, what were they economic? Were they social? What affected it? Whereas people like were starting to ask things like, how do people travel yesterday? Like, we brought a lockdown in the day before yesterday. How did that affect what people did yesterday? Are people afraid to travel on buses? Are they going back to the office in trains? And they wanted to know it like every day, and they wanted to know it for the day before. And when I say people, I don't just mean like ministers. This was like my mum wanted to know this as well. So we had to think about like, how do we get this message across to like ministers, but how do we get it across to the general public as well? And we broke this down in kind of like 3 different questions. So the first one is like, what's the one salient bit of information people want? Like I say, people said they wanted the whole packet of Jaffa cakes. People wanted everything we had. But like in the balance, what was the one thing they wanted? And the one thing that most people wanted was how many people are traveling on different modes of transport day by day. And that was the main thing that people wanted. The next one is like, where could we innovate to get different sources of data? So in some cases, we just didn't have the data for that information. The agreements we had with suppliers, the way we analysed their data, we just didn't have it on a daily basis. So it required this massive innovation of like, where can we get new data? How can we interpret existing data differently? And how can we, like it was alluded to at the start, how can we make compromises so we can get this figure out to people, even if we couldn't get some of the other figures we provide like on an annual basis out to them? And then the third one is kind of what factors need to be balanced to make this possible, which I'm going to talk about a little bit here. So it was all kind of a give and get situation. So as I mentioned, the timeliness, there was no end to what people would ask for in terms of timeliness. If you said, we can give you an update every minute, people would go, brilliant, excellent. So you had to kind of balance that against the fact that we do still need lengthy QA. Like I say, we need these stats to be quality, and we need them to have like this certain amount of rigor. So we're not saying, okay, this is how people traveled yesterday, and then we go, oh no, wait, they didn't, that's completely wrong. So we managed this by working a lot with these kind of modal teams that were experts. So they handled a lot of the QA. They would provide us with stats that we knew to be good quality. And then our approach, when we got to this kind of final QA stage, was much more looking at the trends, looking at how modes compared to each other, rather than like this granular level, like how were these stats actually calculated. The next one was coverage and granularity. So like I say, again, people wanted to know what was happening in my town, what was happening in my area, like as granular as they could get it in terms of geography. This is balanced against kind of commercial sensitivity, especially for things like trains and buses. If you're talking about how are people traveling in a specific area, you're often talking about how they're traveling with a specific company. And that's a big, companies don't like telling you how well they're doing in terms of economy, especially in a time like COVID. So there was a balance there of the data were being provided, how could we get this information across to people without hitting a point where data suppliers said, no, we're providing you business critical, sensitive information, we don't want that being shared. So a lot of that, I'll talk about that kind of in a second, is that we use kind of index values, we used it across the whole country. So we did everything we could to provide a meaningful information, but it was still kind of commercially acceptable to the data owners. We then had a big thing on kind of clarity of commentary. So like I say, a lot of people were getting into data for the first time ever with this, people who didn't have a lot else to do in lockdown were looking at statistics. And so we needed this to be really, really clear. If you only came away with one message, this was the message to come away with, which was really kind of heavily balanced against the fact that there were a lot more assumptions and caveats than you might expect with kind of traditional national stats with these data. So, for example, things like the baselines we used in indices were different across different modes. You couldn't necessarily, we had a lot of people try and do things like rolling averages, which you couldn't do. So it was very hard to kind of get this kind of complex statistical information across to people while keeping it all accessible. So we worked really hard with this. We had a supplementary kind of methodology information that was written in kind of very plain language. And we had, we responded very promptly to queries as well. People would come back with us quite regularly. Can you do this? Can you use the data like this? And we pointed them to the methodology, but we were also kind of happy to explain that as well. And the last one is, like I say, this kind of idea of demand for data. So like I said, there was no end to kind of the demand for this data. But we really wanted to kind of moderate that with this kind of intelligent transparency. So we didn't just want to provide people an endless array of data. Some of it wasn't that great quality, some of it wasn't that reliable. We wanted to give people a hand-picked selection of data that we knew was going to be useful for them and meaningful for them, especially given that, like I say, a lot of these people wouldn't be statisticians and maybe wouldn't be as confident with what we were saying when we were saying, oh yeah, well, it's an indicator, but it's not possibly 100% accurate. So this is the outcome that we got. So you can see on the right-hand side what we put out. So it's an index level for each of the modes. So you can see it's broken down. So we have daily travel for motor vehicles, buses, trains, so on and so forth. And it's, like I say, it's indexed against a pre-COVID baseline. So you can see how transport has changed post-COVID rather than an absolute number of how many people are travelling day to day. And we do still put this data out to this day, actually, if you're interested in seeing it. So a big part of this, like I say, was bringing in new sources of data. So some of this was telecoms data. So for the first time, we worked with a telecoms company. They have very granular insights as to how people on their network are travelling. We did a lot of work to understand how this could feed into particularly active travel metrics, so things like cycling and walking and stuff like that. This was combined with our road traffic counts. So we have road traffic counts that are very robust. We use them very regularly in all our national statistics. But we also use these for the first time to put together a daily cycling metric in combination with the telecoms data, and this was the first time we'd used the data in this way. And then we also worked with kind of data partners, so Ticketer do ticketing for buses in a large part of the country. And again, we worked with them to get provision of their data on a daily basis and with quite a good geographic split and things like that. So we use this to provide, like I say, a large number of real-time insights to 10 Downing Street and Sage throughout COVID. So if you ever saw, on the big screen and the next please slide situation, if you ever saw things about transport usage, that was probably our data. But like I said, we also made a real effort. So we published this, just the headline figure of the key daily usage indices. We put these out on a weekly basis and with kind of a 2-day latency, which is not something we'd had before. So when our data went out at 9:30 on a Wednesday morning, it included data for the Monday, the day before yesterday sort of thing. There was also another payoff, which we probably didn't think about at the time, but is probably maybe the most impactful. It's kind of the shaping our future ways of working in DFT. So the big one I think we had is this kind of improving our resilience in responding to kind of unprecedented events. So a big one we had a lot more recently was obviously the death of the Queen and her funeral. we were very set up to respond very quickly to that, to monitor kind of crowd numbers across London and transport usage. And we used this kind of learning, and within 24 hours of hearing the news, we had like a crowd monitoring system set up so we could keep an eye on that. So this is the kind of thing, like we learned to respond much better at pace, to quality assured pace, to know what's possible and what's not in that time. We also have an expanded suite of these kind of published faster indicator metrics. So like I say, the COVID daily usage stats are still coming out, they're still very widely used. But we've also used this kind of publishing vehicle to put out other series. So some of these are longer, some of them are just kind of very, if there's a specific topic of interest, we can kind of pivot quite quickly and put out these kind of much faster indicators that don't have kind of the trappings of like an official statistic behind them that you would expect, like the publication and things like that. But they do give people the data they want to see. We've also used this methodology to kind of inform new series. So like I mentioned about the cycling data, we've actually changed that now, so that's now put out as a slightly less frequent series, but it kind of combines the best of both worlds, so the learning from the daily figures and the kind of robustness that you'd expect from maybe the annual statistics to provide something that's kind of in between in terms of regularity, but also like the quality and like expansiveness of it. We've also started using a lot more kind of digital tools, so things like Google Analytics, backlink checkers, things like that, to understand what people are using our statistics for. That's what this image on the left is. This is the kind of backlinks checking of the daily usage stats that we put out. And this is one of the key reasons that we carried on actually producing these statistics way past COVID. So this was right in kind of the heat of COVID. Obviously, a lot of people were using it to kind of produce COVID insights, but an awful lot of people were using it for other things. So around 60% of the examples we found online, people were using it for other uses. So it's things like talking about rail strikes, talking about the economic impacts of various changes, even talking about things like how effective like active travel initiatives had been, or thinking about like what various like pollutant levels were and things like that. So really uses we hadn't expected, and we hadn't expected this to be that popular. But we can get this kind of insight without your traditional like sticking a survey out and asking people if they like our statistics. It's a nice way to see what people are doing with them. Also, so obviously, like the timelines we're talking about with these statistics, it wouldn't be possible without a decent level of kind of automation, reproducible analysis. We're massive users of R and things like GitHub. Hadley Wickham's talk yesterday was like a dream for me. But this is like a really big thing that's come in. It's not just across our regular statistic, these kind of very frequent statistics now. It's also across like our more standard, like quarterly, annual publications. A lot of those rely on a high amount of coding and automation to produce like a high quality product, but also one that's done quite rapidly and gives like frees up analyst time for things like these kind of policy insights and stuff like that. So it's a real benefit both to like us as producers, but our users of statistics as well. And then the final one is kind of like right-sized data formats. So we've realized as well with these stats that a lot of people are keen to do their own like data analysis on the stats that we put out. So we're not just thinking about like a report and ODS tables, we're also thinking about things that people can pick up easily for data science. So things like CSVs that they can read in and kind of make their own insights too. And yet we're kind of considering that in the future. It'd be nice to get like APIs out with our data and stuff like that, but we're like constantly thinking about like what innovation should look like in this space. Yeah, and that's pretty much it. Thank you.
Thank you. Great talk. I'm interested in where you see the balance between clearly the benefits that these new high-resolution, new data streams provide, and also the benefits that you have from a sort of a long-term consistent data set for informing indices and models. So, yeah, where would you see the kind of balance between those two things?
Yeah, it's a really great question, actually, I think, and I was surprised. So I think a lot of people do like analysis of like how long people read like statistical reports and stuff like that. And it's often quite low, and I took that as like a sign that people aren't that interested. What they want are these kind of like faster tables and stuff like that. But when we were revamping these kind of COVID stats, the daily usage ones, we actually added like a report, like entirely generated, but like speculative, and that has got way more views than just the raw data itself, and shows that, like say, even in these kind of very quick turnaround statistics, people have a genuine interest in these different formats, and they do really value like a data visualization that you've put together and like a report. And often maybe people are reading reports quickly because they know exactly what they want from it and they go to exactly the right place, rather than I'm thinking they're going, nah, it's okay, I've read it, sort of thing. So I think there is still massive value, but I think it's about that balance, and I think especially at DFT, we're not afraid to kind of rejig that. So like to ask the question of our users, to try different formats, to try cutting down a statistic, or like I say, putting out a report associated with these kind of faster indicators to make sure we're meeting those user needs. And I think it is always a bit of a balance, but I think we're trying quite hard to kind of achieve that with like user engagement.
Hi, great talk, thank you very much. I think I caught you saying a phrase that I was just really interested in, and maybe something we can pick up with Ed when we get on to the wider chat. I think you said that producing the stats in this way kind of freed you from the trappings of official statistics, or words to that effect. And I was really genuinely interested because we're also, I'm from Public Health Scotland, kind of thinking about doing a lot of our releases this way, but we're really still keen to have them as official statistics and conform with the code, but sometimes the code doesn't quite sit with what we're trying to do. Can you just tell us a bit more about what you meant by that, and do you regard all this as official statistics still?
Yeah, so that is probably me, like my kind of feeling about these as being, they feel like they sit slightly differently to our publications, but like I say, they are still very much official statistics. We sit very clearly within the code of practice and stuff like that. There was, obviously, during COVID, there was quite a lot of people who needed pre-release of these, so they were handled often like as management information and things like that. But yeah, the ones that we put out have always been official statistics, and we've stuck to the code with those. So yeah, sorry, there isn't, like I say, like a sneaky way around it in that sense. But yeah, it's more thinking of it compared to the big kind of official statistics with big report and tables that we're thinking of.
Thank you, that's very interesting. So you detailed like the lengths you went to explain the assumptions and caveats. Did you ever find cases where like your data has been completely misused or misunderstood, and do you like push back on that or just roll your eyes?
Yeah, so quite often people were very good at contacting us. I mean, I guess the only limitation of that is we don't ever see the ones that like people make and like send to their friends or whatever. So we're a little bit limited there. I think the only real like egregious example we had where somebody hadn't contacted us in advance is that someone put out, I think it was on Twitter, they'd done some kind of weekly averages of the percentages that we'd put out. And it got so much, obviously everything was those people on Twitter don't follow like official government accounts, but this has got massively more views than ours and lots of people engaged with it. So we did actually reply and say like, you might want to look at the methodology, because they'd ended up doing things like averaging things that had already been weekly averaged, and like obviously the indices couldn't be and stuff like that. So again, it's a great example that like if they'd contacted us, we could have kind of like explained that quite easily. But yeah, generally like we were actually surprised by kind of the level of statistical competency the people who got in touch with us had, and like the kind of the questions they had were like a very kind of high level and showed a good understanding of the methodology we'd put out.
So the case studies have illustrated many of the things that statisticians have to think about and worry about when they have to make decisions under pressure. We've seen sets of case studies where there is huge decisions on the line, and the statistics is going to come in and help make those decisions, or at least help inform those decisions. So what was common to those these 3 case studies, but also the other 5 that made up those case studies, and could we drill out any principles from those? So we've come up with a set of draft principles. We're really interested in feedback, so please do let us know what you think. If you go onto the RSS website and go to the Statistics Under Pressure page, you'll see this graph, or this graphic of the principles. If you click on each principle, it will give you a little bit more information about the principle itself. If you click again, you'll get all the information about how we've got through that principle, where it comes from, and which case studies it links to, and how that's been informed within that principle. So, as you might imagine, there are a number of principles that have come out, and we've picked 5 that we think are most important. So the first one is really understanding what the output of the data analysis is going to be and what the stakeholders need. So I think we saw a really excellent example in the transport statistic of trying to choose what's the salient piece of information people really need to know. How do we really understand what people need to know and then give that to them, rather than all the things they think they need, but in actual fact it's not necessarily going to be the decision that you need to take. You're also going to have to make choices. We saw very clearly in Vicky's case, there were lots and lots of choices needed to be made about how you got the data in and what you did with it. And you need to then prioritize. And that's fine. Prioritizing is fine as long as you justify why you're doing it. So we shouldn't assume that people have to do the perfect thing. What they have to do is prioritize and then justify why they've made those choices. And that should be enough. So that's the kind of understanding that we really need in order to sort of, justify the kind of statistics that come out of this. We need to think about the risks, and we need to then try and mitigate them as much as possible. But note that there will be risks, and we should explain what they are. So really, really think about the risks and how we might mitigate them, and how we might build that into the modeling itself. We should be absolutely transparent and make the communication accessible. And I think you'll see in all the case studies that we should really try to, that they've really gone out of their way to make sure that the communication between the people that need to use the information and the statisticians and analysts is really, really key and critical. And getting that accessible, clear, intelligible communication between the stakeholders, both sides, is really important. And then finally, you need to think about what's going on, and you need to adapt it as you go along. And I think we saw in the Badger example, for example, people thought about how to change things as they went along. Really, really think about how we can use those things and then actually say that statistics and analysis isn't a one-shot deal. We always now do the same thing forever. We adapt it, we change it. So these are the 5 principles, but I really would encourage you to go onto the website, go onto the RSS website, look at the statistics under pressure pages and look at the principles and look at the details behind them, because I think this does give people some kind of idea of, if you're put under pressure, what are the things you should be thinking about? And if I do these things, then there is a justifiable set of decisions that you can now say, this is what we did and this is why we did it. But it's really not for me to say whether that's sensible or not. It's for other people to say that's sensible. And one of those people is Ed. So I'm going to ask Ed to come up and give his thoughts on the principles, and then we'll have a wider discussion. Ed.
Thank you very much, John. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ed Humpherson. I'm head of the Office for Statistics Regulation. Now, the Office for Statistics Regulation, OSR, we are variously described. We're sometimes described as the UK's regulator for official statistics. Sometimes in the media, we're called the statistics watchdog. And in my favourite article in the Daily Mail, I was personally described as the watchdog who cracks down on dodgy stats. Now, I'm sure you also can think of some other names we might be called, but I'm not going to go into those. Let's just go, for the moment, with the watchdog that cracks down on dodgy stats. So you might expect that standing before you, the watchdog that cracks down on dodgy stats, I'm going to say that a lot, so it kind of gets embedded. The watchdog that cracks down on dodgy stats, that you might expect me to be a stickler for quality, for processes of quality, and to take a pretty hard line on the use of incomplete data and in uncertain situations. So it might seem that that stickler for rigor and quality might sort of be uncomfortable with the principles that John has outlined and the spirit of statistics under pressure. Well, nothing is further from the truth. I and we are a really strong supporter of these statistics under pressure principles. And in fact, that's not just a stated preference that I'm saying now for the purposes of being part of this session. It's actually a revealed preference. Because if you look at the 3 main things that we advocate at present, they're all very consistent with the principles. The first thing, which is an enduring feature of our mission, is to advocate for the public good of statistics and data. And that really the essence of that is that statistics produced by government are not some pursuit of perfection, of technical perfection, but they are for practical use. And that practical use, above all, is to inform understanding. And to do that, they should be available not just for decision makers within government, but available for a very wide population of users, citizens, researchers, charities, and so on. And in fact, 2 things to pull out from that. I was delighted to hear Fran use the phrase intelligent transparency, because I think that's really the spirit of this making information available. And also, just a plug, on Thursday I'm speaking in an excellent session on public statistics, which is the RSS's way of encapsulating this idea, and it's a tremendous initiative, so please do join that session. So that's the first thing, public good. I think Statistics Under Pressure is all about ensuring that the work of statisticians serves the public good. Second thing we advocate very strongly is analytical leadership. And for analytical leadership, we look for statisticians, analysts in government, not simply to be the experts in the corner who sort of say why something can't be done or why something isn't a reliable conclusion, but actually to be helpful for the organization and for the decision maker to ensure that the organizations that the analyst serves in, those organizations are as well informed as possible. And I think Statistics Under Pressure really captures that sense, and these principles really do speak to that analytical leadership. I thought the Badger story, Crystal's Badger story, was a story of analytical leadership. And the third thing that we really advocate a lot is what I'd call a more rounded view of uncertainty. And by more rounded, I would contrast a technical view of uncertainty in which a statistician says, can I quantify the uncertainty using the technical tools of statistics? And if not, to either to not say anything or to use a boilerplate phrase like you should use some caution. To contrast that, a very technical sort of idiom, with what I would regard as a much more contextual and thoughtful approach to uncertainty, which is, can I explain what can and cannot be inferred from these statistics based on the questions that I know users have? And once again, these principles speak very deeply, I think, to that idea of stepping away from the constraints of a highly technical understanding of what uncertainty is into something which is about the cognitive processes that users might be going through when they confront a new data set. So for these three reasons, I'm a really strong supporter of Statistics Under Pressure. I think that Statistics Under Pressure speaks to the public good. I think that Statistics Under Pressure requires and celebrates analytical leadership. And I think that these principles embed within them a cognitive, a contextual, a broad idea of uncertainty, which steps beyond what I regard as an often a constricting technical way of thinking about uncertainty. So let me slightly modify what I said at the beginning. I said, I am not a stickler. That's only half right. I'm not a stickler for really rigorous views of quality which limit and inhibit what statisticians can do. But I think I have become, in the course of learning about Statistics Under Pressure, a stickler for Statistics Under Pressure. It's a great initiative and I really commend it. Thank you.
Well, we thought we would have the whole steering group for Statistics Under Pressure plus the speakers up so that you could ask questions about the project as a whole, about the ideas, and also follow up on things that you've seen during the discussions. So I will look to see if there are any questions to start with. But very quickly, should we, for the people who haven't spoken already, should we just ask what kind of things they think they've seen as being in Statistics Under Pressure in the work they've done themselves, or why it's useful for their work going forward.
So from my point of view, it's the prioritisation piece that I think is critical, because I think it encapsulates two issues. The first is that actually often under pressure you can't have it all, and you've got to make choices, but the most important things is that you make those choices, as you know, it said about statistical leadership, not that you're a victim of choices that other people make for you. And then I think the second piece is really about recognising that my choices may not be your choices, but I do need to be able to justify them. And there isn't one right answer. This is the art of statistics, but it's about that kind of conscious reasoned choice.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Paul Allen, the RSS's Honorary Officer for Official Statistics. I'm grateful to Ed for giving the plug to public statistics. Do come home to the session on Thursday morning and we talk some more about this. It's a long time since I left official statistics, but I kind of echo the principles that we're coming to. They can resonate with things I particularly remember where systems were getting out of date, where systems were working fine, but they weren't able to meet the current needs of what was happening. It wasn't just that something quickly blew up, but it was, for example, when I was working in tourism many years ago, people just realized that tourism was actually more important in the economy than it ever had been. And so the statistics on the visitors to the UK that came in month by month, several months in arrears, didn't really give a modern picture of what was going on. And there's a lot of pressure there to kind of look for new ways of doing things and supplement those. So yeah, that's what I think. Take from this. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Claire Griffiths. I led the COVID-19 dashboard team. There's probably lots of examples from that feed into the principles, but something that's not been mentioned yet, I think, is burnout, so like staff burnout. I think at the start of doing that, we were quite good. We kind of rotated people into teams, rotated them out after they'd spent a bit of time. And then as things went on, the team kind of got embedded. That was the team doing it. You were doing it every day, 7 days a week, Christmas Day, Boxing Day. And then with Public Health England being abolished partway through, it then made it even more difficult to kind of rotate people in and out of the team. So on reflection, I think we probably should have spent a bit more time thinking about that and bringing different people in. So that's my reflection that's not been mentioned so far.
Questions from?
Thank you. There's been quite a bit of talk today already about a lot of the case studies are situations where we're in quite a data sparse scenario where we don't have access to the data we need or want. And I guess in those situations, we often, as Crystal mentioned, rely on scenario-driven models, maybe mechanistic or physical computer models. And I wonder what the panel thinks about the role of statisticians and statistics in those cases is relative to where we have all the data that we need.
Grab a couple before we go. Andy, should we go Andy first and then we'll come back?
You know, often we look to inform rather than persuade, but we look to inform because we've got the full data. In this situation where you don't have the full data, is there a temptation to move into persuade?
Fran mentioned creating new data sets during COVID, particularly cycling, which I would love to have had 10 years before that, having done childhood obesity and stuff, adult obesity. I just wondered where the money came from to fund it. And was that part of the deficit now of COVID? But well done for getting it. And then how do you do that quality? Because I was trying to do quality in local authorities for collecting cycling data. Not easy, but just asking, we do need new data sets. We do need our public health minimum data sets back. And we do need, hope under the new government, we'll get a bit more money for better statistics. There you go.
Brian, do you want to quickly answer the money question? How did you go about getting the resources?
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Yeah, great question. Thank you. So yeah, a big part of this was working out how we kind of balance resources with this, because you don't have an unlimited pot of money, like you say, and number of people. So most of the things we already had in some format. So like I say, the cycling data came from the traffic counts that we already have. It was a case of processing them in a different way. We already had a call-off contract with the telecoms company, so it's a case of making use of that to extract the data from them. But the biggest cost in that sense was time from the statisticians to actually do all of the work. So that's always, we're always kind of working with that in government, like deprioritising other projects. COVID was obviously a massive priority, kind of in the immediate term. So we managed to kind of bring resource from other teams, deprioritise some of the other things that we would have done routinely. Obviously, COVID kind of stopped some things that were happening as well, so that kind of freed up that. But yeah, I agree, it's always a challenge, and I think like most institutions have like massive things. If you gave them another 1,000 people, they'd clearly have an idea of what they put them to do and what they'd be able to produce with it. But I guess the balance is always like the value, especially for us, the value for the taxpayer. Like, if I want another 1,000 people to explore like a really intrinsic part of stats, I might love that. You might not when you see like the impact on your tax bill, I guess. So it's a nice balance, I think, there.
like to answer the question about informing versus persuading?
Oh, that can be a slippery slope, can't it? I mean, as somebody working in infectious disease epidemiology, there have been a number of instances where I've helped, produce some piece of evidence, and then the people making the decision say, oh, okay, so we'd like to bring you out and have you talk about this, and you can explain that's why we did this. And so, I mean, thinking back to foot and mouth disease, for example, sort of, okay, we've decided on a certain control policy, and this is it. And I think that over time we've become more aware of the sort of trying to draw the lines between being, seen as some sort of justification for this one policy and making sure it's, this is the evidence. And then you can say, and, as a result, this decision has been made. But as we've seen in other contexts, a particular piece of evidence almost never points to just one decision. And it's just one component of it. But it, particularly if you're in a setting where, I'm a big fan of vaccination, even though I didn't work on vaccines, so I would like to persuade people to get vaccinated because I think it would be good for them. I usually turn it around if, like, I'm getting vaccinated, I'm having my kids vaccinated. But it's a difficult line, and when you're being asked about diseases that are affecting, food supply and livelihood or people, it's difficult to sort of to keep that line, but somehow trying to make a distinction between talking about the work that you've done versus talking about your own decisions, and sort of trying to do that and making sure, statisticians make decisions as well, but it doesn't mean that they're, necessarily more valuable than other people's.
Can I just add something on that? And thank you to Crystal, because I've been thinking, Andy, about your question about inform versus persuade, and realizing that I'm not sure I have got the answer to that. And I was going to suggest that it's something that the group might want to build into the next iteration. I think it's a really, really useful thing. But actually, I think your observations are spot on. The additional thought that I was mulling over was that, of course, we don't want analysts, statisticians, to have a prior view of what they want the decision to be. That is not the role. And I think statisticians must be assiduous in not bringing or allowing their prior presumptions to influence how they present their findings. I think the risk is that can sometimes tip over into a kind of excessive neutrality. It's not my job to say what decision this should be, can tip over. It's not really my job to say what these numbers mean. And I think you do sometimes see that in the official statistics system, and I think it really undermines analytical leadership. So I think the way I'd put it is, you shouldn't be seeking to persuade as to what decision should be taken, but you should be seeking to persuade people that you really do understand what the numbers mean, where they're from, what their limitations are, and what inferences can be drawn for them. Be assertive in that form of communication.
I mean, you don't always have a lot of choice around that. You just have to work with what you've got. And again, it comes back to the, not so much persuasion, but justification. There are methodologies out there that can try and deal with the smaller data, and it's thinking about if that would be fitting for what you have. Obviously, in my example, we couldn't use certain small data methodologies because obviously we couldn't bootstrap or imagine data. We just had to work with this data as it was. So again, it's kind of justifying the methodologies that you're going to use and work with the data from that.
But again, I mean, I think it's why the fifth principle is about monitoring and adapting. Yeah, because I think when you start, you have nothing, and then you have a bit, and it is, as you say, about not just churning the handle and doing the same thing we've always done.
So I'm going to take two more questions because we're running out of time, but I think we can get two more in. So one there and one there.
Yes, this mainly refers to the first case study. I was wondering to what extent there was consideration of the potential that the effect of the intervention might be different later on, that the effect in the first year might be quite different to the second and the third and later years. I wasn't clear to what extent that came into the debate about the decision to discontinue that treatment, whether that treatment was considered less likely to have those long-term effects than the proactive culling, for example. and I guess, I mean, this is quite a general thing, that you might often embark on a program that isn't necessarily going to have all its impacts in the first year or even in the first 2 or 3 years, and how perhaps the patience to delay a decision in those situations might be required.
Thanks. I just wanted to follow up Claire's point about the statisticians under pressure when all of this work is happening, and just wanting to think a bit about which of the 5 principles do their needs and requirements come under. And I think there's something about the pressure experience at the point in which you're in the kind of in the heat of it, and also then how do people adapt and adjust back to kind of business as usual. And I suppose connected to that is, how do organizations work? So what is it that optimizes some organizations to work well under pressure, including supporting their staff, and what is it that makes some organizations less able to do this kind of work? I think that's...
So, Crystal, would you like to answer the first question, and then the more general point about...
Okay, sure. I mean, remember, it has been quite a while now, but I don't remember there being discussion about, you know, could these be a temporary effect that went away? I think it was really focused on, is this a real thing? You know, have you made some terrible mistake here? And going through the protocol of how we went through that. So I think that's partly because it hadn't been anticipated as somehow there'll be a cost at the beginning and savings later. I mean, I think if we then look at the data that has been collected since then and look at the results that we found for the proactive culling. So proactive culling was the repeated culling of the whole 100 square kilometer areas, and that had, at least in the early years, particularly notable negative effects in the 2 kilometers outside where the culling had taken place. So if you extrapolate down to small culls, you might expect there to be this sort of, this short-term detrimental effect. But because those small culls were moving around, you might get those detrimental effects following wherever your reactive culls went. But it wasn't a consideration then. I think that it was seen as unacceptable, even if it was a short-term thing, to ask people to take this on, that they were, you know, you're looking to make things better, and there wasn't any appetite for a government study that was going to make things worse, even if it were in the short term.
Brilliant, thank you. And who would like to talk about, I mean, Claire, you've already talked about statisticians who are under pressure. Would others like to go on? Claire, you want to say any more, the statisticians themselves?
I mean, I think it comes under the principle of monitor and adapt. So you're kind of monitoring staff well-being, adapting to the situation. In terms of like organisations that do it well, it comes, I would say, from the leadership. You know, the organisational culture is set from the top and it filters down. People behave like they see their leaders behave. So that's my perspective on it.
Anyone else?
So one of the things that I helped organize while working with the COVID team at Imperial College London was that we actually brought in a set of coaches who were providing both one-to-one coaching for senior members of staff and sort of peer coaching to sort of train them up on that, which was incredibly useful. And in fact, a number of those coaches, because they wanted to contribute to what was going on, even beyond the point at which we paid for a certain amount of coaching, some people continued those relationships for more than a year of getting coaching. So it was a good way of doing that. But certainly, I've had people yell at me quite loudly because of the results that I found. And I mean, that's very frustrating. And someone pointed out to me, well, if the data had been a different way, then they'd have thought, that person would have thought you're a hero. I was trying to step back from both of those things. I'm a statistician. So whether or not you like the results at the end, the point is that I did it in a coherent, well-principled way and explain it clearly, and then trying to detach yourself from any emotional response that gives.
Brilliant. Well, the session's over and I've overrun. So, thank you all for staying. I want to thank everybody for contributing. I want to thank everyone for the questions, which were really, really good. Hopefully, most of the questions that were online I've at least been tangentially reflected in the questions that were asked in the room as well. But I just want to thank everybody for the session.